Greetings. I'm Tim Searchinger. I'm a senior research scholar at Princeton University and the technical director for agriculture and forestry at the World Resources Institute. And the talk today is about whether the shift to make more buildings from wood rather than concrete and steel, mass timber, is good for the climate or not, as many people are advocating a climate solution. I'm going to explain why we believe that, in fact, that's likely to increase carbon in the atmosphere rather than decrease it, and also could have very large environmental effects. And the reason is, basically, most of the wood does not get into the building and instead goes up into the atmosphere. This talk is based in part on a paper we had in Nature last year called The Carbon Cost of Global Wood Harvest, and also an associated report called The Global Land Squeeze. So let's start with just understanding that global land squeeze. Today, the human effects on the terrestrial ecosystem have caused the loss of something like 25% of the carbon into the atmosphere. And this is due to agricultural conversion, but also it's due to management, to the loss of carbon in forests. So this was a paper in 2018 in Nature, and in the red you see the carbon lost. High red means almost all the carbon lost from vegetation in the top meter of soils. But it's not just agricultural conversion. The blue is the carbon loss due to management on existing remaining forests, and that's mostly forestry activities. So that's a big deal. In fact, in a more recent paper in Nature just in December, authors found that the amount of carbon lost from existing forests, which is primarily due to forestry, exceeds, even by a small amount, the carbon lost due to the conversion of forest to agriculture. And they, and in other papers, people have said, yeah, the way to get that carbon back is to harvest less wood. But this is only part of the overall land squeeze. Today, we are still converting large areas of land for cropping and pasture. What you're seeing here is a map from a paper, a good satellite study, showing cropland expansion in recent decades. The red is expansion. The blue is actually where we're having cropland abandoned, in some cases where forests are regrowing, and that's important. I'm going to come back to that. But the basic story is that about 11 million hectares per year are 10 million arable, 1 million permanent of cropland is expanding on a net basis. And if it continues to do that, we will convert an area of other habitats the size of India by 2050. And meanwhile, all climate strategies pretty much rely on having no more agricultural conversion, and many rely on actually reducing agricultural land. And yet the challenge is that due to population growth and rising incomes, pretty much everyone projects vastly more increased demand. 50% or so more increase in crops in 40 years at least. Livestock products like basically meat and milk, which use a lot more land per calorie, they're expected to grow by about 70%, and urban land also is expanding. So this is huge competition for land, creates a huge challenge. In our Nature paper, we estimated wood demand, and wood demand is also likely to grow by about 50% over a 40-year period. Some of that growth in demand will be due to wood fuel, but in fact, we're expecting wood fuel consumption to decline somewhat per person in developing countries, although wood fuel is still used quite a lot in wealthier countries. So it's not really wood fuel that's the driver, but instead it's commercial wood harvest. Most of the people in the world are very poor. They consume very little energy. They consume very little meat and milk. They also consume very little wood other than wood for fires, for household fires. They don't consume paper. They don't have many buildings out of wood. So as incomes rise, we are going to expect increased demand for those products. And that's going to contribute to this 50% increase in demand for wood overall. So in our paper, we estimated that over the next 40 years, the average carbon loss would be somewhere between 3.5 and more than 4 billion tons of CO2 per year. That's more than 3 times the amount of emissions from aviation. This is a kind of special annualized type of calculation. What you're seeing here are different scenarios with different assumptions of how wood will be supplied. But basically, the bottom line is a large number and a big challenge. So given that fact, it's obvious that we need to do everything we can to hold down the human carbon footprint, the human footprint on the global land. And that means we need to try to hold down the land we require per person in our diets by having wealthy people consume less meat and milk. We need to have less food waste. We also need to produce more on the same land. And some combination of that we can hope will lead to our not needing more land. And that's true for forestry as well as for agriculture. And an obvious policy implication of that is we don't want to make the problem worse. So how much worse would the wood problem be if we tried to make even 50% of our timber of our construction in the future out of wood? So in this chart, what you see is here, the dark color here, the kind of greenish blue, is the amount of wood demand basically in 2010. And the light green shows a kind of a doubling of that wood demand by 2050 if we just keep on present trends. Remember, we said a 54% increase overall, but actually it's larger by the time you get to 2050. Now, the orange and the brown represent the additional amount of wood you would have to harvest if you wanted to provide 50% of the construction by 2050 with wood, 50% more for the construction with wood. And that you can see is basically roughly, that's greater than all existing total wood harvest. So in effect, we're looking at a scenario where we have to double global wood harvest by 2050, but also that we're going to have could triple it if we increased demand for wood for construction. So then how should we assess the carbon costs of wood harvest and use? The basic reason using wood for construction increases carbon is that only a small amount of that wood and therefore carbon gets into the building. Obviously, if all of it got into the building, then we wouldn't lose any carbon. And then as forests grew back, we gain carbon. But in fact, when you harvest wood, you have tremendous losses from slash and roots. Bark is almost always burned. Much of the wood harvested is too small to use for any kind of timber purpose. And then on top of that, there's waste in the actual milling processes and production processes. So here's one way to think about it. About 40% of the carbon in a forest, and probably more, is lost from these roots and residues, and they will decompose fairly quickly and go into the atmosphere. The bark adds another 10%. And then I'm going to kind of relatively conservatively estimate that the wastes at the lumber mill and CLT plant are only kind of half of what remains. Now, that doesn't mean they don't use for any purpose. You get these kinds of offcuts, and they can be used for other wood products, or for many are just burned for bioenergy. But the point is that carbon goes into the atmosphere pretty quickly. So only a small amount, 20, 25%, I think we might expect to actually be able to make it into a building. Now, a forest will regrow, and that's good, and we reclaim the carbon, but If you don't harvest the wood, the forest will also keep growing. Now, for a few years, in fact, the forest would grow faster if you don't harvest it than these young trees grow. After a few years, it depends on the forest type, the regrowing forest will grow faster, and you'll eventually, after some decades, typically, pay off the carbon debt, meaning the combination of everything you will have not lost carbon compared to not harvesting wood. But even once you've done that with your first year's harvest of wood for CLT, you still have carbon debt on subsequent years. And that extends even longer, therefore, the period before you pay off the carbon debt, typically into many, many decades. In the case of bioenergy, often for centuries. And this is what you call the real landscape approach. This is the effect of harvesting multiple stands of wood over multiple years over a landscape. So this is a complicated graphic, and this explains how we assess the impact of harvesting wood. It's called the all pools approach, and we didn't invent it. And what you see is in the green line is the amount of carbon that is stored in a hectare of forest if it's not harvested. We're using a kind of a typical forest type in Germany. So let's say the year we harvest it, it's got maybe something like 140 tons of carbon, and it will grow over time. German forests tend to continue to grow fairly well into kind of an older age, but this will slowly decline. Now, what happens in the first year? Well, it's hard to tell from just this graphic, but the carbon in the forest itself will probably go down by about this much, just in the first year. And the reason the black line goes up is because there's another thing going on. So the black line represents the carbon that's stored in all the different pools after the harvest. Now, that includes the slash and residues. That includes carbon and wood products, including CLT and any other wood products the wood gets into. Over time, it includes the regrowing forest, this light green. And in this case, we also assumed that it saved a lot of carbon that would otherwise be stored in limestone or in coal or underground and fossil fuels, on the theory that the production emissions from making CLT are lower than the production emissions of making concrete and steel. I'm not confident anymore that we were generous, that I believe maybe we were too generous in this number. Now, because of that, in the first year, despite the loss of carbon in the forest, you actually get a net carbon gain. But that quickly disappears as basically these different slash piles and things and would decompose. And then it kind of levels off for a while. There's regrowth, but also the forest would have grown anyway. And our estimate is that after 40 years, you still have put more carbon in the atmosphere than if you hadn't harvested the wood. And that is even compared to the alternative of using concrete and steel for construction. And here it's about 36 tons of carbon per hectare of wood. And we use a kind of a discounting approach, which kind of emphasizes the greater value and importance of reducing emissions earlier rather than later. Even by that discounting approach, you have an increase in carbon by 26 tons. And we can also look at it as a percentage change. So there are certain emissions. Let's say there were, for a moment, let's say there were 100 tons of emissions from using concrete and steel in building. And this estimates that that would result in a 57% increase in the emissions for that part of the building construction. So basically, the bottom line is in temperate forests, even if we quite generously assume that 40% of the wood gets into CLT, that we're still going to have an increase in carbon in the atmosphere when you factor in the loss of carbon in the forest. Now, in some scenarios, we looked at, well, what if you have even a 70% gets into CLT? Well, in that case, some temperate forests could generate a very small greenhouse gas reduction, but quite small. But I think that is a completely unrealistic scenario. So the counter argument that wood is good, that using more wood is good, is based on essentially the claim that wood is carbon neutral. Now, the claim that wood is carbon neutral basically means this. It basically means that the carbon that is emitted to the atmosphere doesn't count. It's not real carbon. It can be ignored. And the theory that is usually offered is that this carbon loss can be ignored so long as other forests, even within a whole country, are growing enough that the net effect, even with the wood harvest, is not to decrease the carbon in the forest. And that's just clearly a math error. It's like saying that a business doesn't lose money because other businesses in the country are gaining money. And the point is, if you didn't lose money, you didn't lose carbon, you would gain more. It's also similar to saying that if I were to take money out of your pension fund each year, but I only take out the amount that you add each year to your pension fund, that you're no poorer. Of course, you are poorer because otherwise your pension fund would grow. Now, this has been pointed out as an error, this carbon neutrality assumption, by hundreds of very distinguished scientists in letters to the European Commission, heads of state. The European Academies of Science has said this multiple times. The European Environment Committee, the European Environment Agency Science Committee has said this, and lots of peer-reviewed papers. Most of the time they say it in the context of bioenergy, but really it's the same story, even if you're talking about wood in buildings, because what we're talking about is the amount of wood that gets, what happens to the carbon that's released in the wood harvest. So we did a literature review of the papers that have looked at the carbon consequences of mass timber. And basically, pretty much every paper that found a benefit assumed that wood was carbon neutral. And some made this extreme assumption that basically harvest was automatically beneficial because you could ignore the carbon that is lost from the forest, but count as a gain the portion of that carbon that isn't lost because it's preserved in the building. So by that example, by that thinking, you could harvest 100 tons of carbon, burn 99, releasing it to the air, store 1 in a building, and that would count as a 1-ton carbon gain or a reduction of carbon in the atmosphere. We found 12 other papers that did a similar method to us, and they basically found, just like us, that basically for decades in general, you'd be increasing carbon in the atmosphere. And the European Commission Joint Research Center has also a paper basically with the same conclusion. So the math error that says that, if you harvest some trees and emit that carbon, it doesn't count so long as other trees are growing, that's so obviously wrong. It raises the question of what people are thinking about who advocate carbon neutrality. And I think what they're really thinking about is that forests, or at least the forest sink, exists because of forest demand. So forests are carbon neutral because basically the forestry, the harvest, the demand for wood should deserve credit for the fact that we have the forest in the first place and the fact that they're growing. Now, is that true? Well, first of all, a very obvious look at a map will tell you that most forests don't exist because of wood demand. I mean, no one really argues that the Congo rainforest exists because of wood demand, or the Amazon rainforest exists because of wood demand, or the Siberian forest, where you're basically too cold to do anything else, exists because of wood demand, same as Canada. And elsewhere, you'll find forests are just often on steep slopes where you can't do anything else. So I don't think anyone really believes that all forests, or even most forests, exist because of wood demand. But I think some people may think that the fact that forests are growing on a net basis could be because of wood demand. But the real reason forests are growing globally on a net basis is because of climate change itself. So here's a map that kind of estimates where forests are growing. You can see everywhere in green, it means forests are growing. And that includes completely unmanaged forests that have been around for a long time, like those in the Amazon and Congo. It's even higher where we used to cut forests a lot. I'll talk about that. But why are forests growing overall, even despite agricultural conversion? And it's largely because with higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, forests grow more. So here's kind of in crude numbers, basically the story. We put about 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year from land conversion or energy use or similar activity. But we generally estimate that only about 20 billion tons stays. 10 billion tons goes quickly into the ocean. And another 10 billion tons is taken up by forests that are growing faster due to climate change itself, mostly CO2 fertilization, maybe warmer temperatures in kind of the northern hemisphere that allow trees to grow longer. Now, the key thing about this is occurring not because of wood demand. It is occurring because of climate change itself. And we've already factored it in. When any of us go driving or flying or emit a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, the way it's estimated is the warming effect of that is estimated as only half a ton. So if somebody else comes now and cuts down those trees and burns them and puts them in the atmosphere, that's adding more carbon to the atmosphere because we've already taken credit for the fact that these trees are growing. And that credit has been assigned to everyone like you and me. Now, another reason forests are growing, and particularly in the northern hemisphere, is because agricultural area has been declining. And it's been declining for a number of reasons, slowly over time. But I'll tell you one surprising reason to many is it's declined a lot just because we got rid of horses. So here's an example, here's an estimate of the number of horses just on farms in the United States. And you can see that there were still huge numbers even into the 1930s. And there were even more horses still being used for transport in other ways. In the US, there's an estimate there were 20 million hectares of oats just for horses in as late as the 1930s. That means there was probably something like another 40 million hectares for pasture. That land became superfluous for agriculture when we shifted to cars and tractors. In a way, they allowed forests to come back. But that, again, wasn't caused by wood demand. Another reason is land. We see forest regrowing in some places is because of land shifting. So in the US, if you go into the northeastern US, New England, you'll find a lot of forests that have rock walls. Now, I don't think people go and build rock walls in forests. The reason is that 100 years ago, almost all those forests were gone. Now, they grew back because it became no longer economical to produce food in the most of the northeastern United States, because it was just so cheap to produce food in the Midwestern United States. Flatter, better lands, things like that. And that phenomenon is not just within countries, it is a global phenomenon as well. In fact, for example, in Europe, there's been effectively a lot of outsourcing of food demand to the tropics. In the paper I had in Nature in 2022, we estimated that the amount of kind of annual carbon losses due to the loss of carbon from forests and savannas on agricultural land that was abroad but supplying Europe was much larger than the amount of essentially avoided deforestation by Europe's exports. And the net of about 400 million tons of CO2 per year is roughly equal to the entire forest carbon sink in Europe. So again, that's kind of a result of outsourcing, it's a result of agricultural changes. Now, despite the fact there have been papers that claim that wood demand leads to more forests. Now, this was a paper using something called the global timber model that claimed, for example, with enough demand for wood for bioenergy, the world would actually plant another more than 1 billion hectares of forests. That's an area, equal to, it was like 3 or 4 times the size of India, actually more like 4 times the size of India. And that is about 2/3 of all the world's cropland, which also raises the question of where our food would come from. Now, the reason for that was that they claimed that based on one US study, they claimed that doubling the profitability of forestry would cause a 30% increase in global forest area. But unfortunately, they misinterpreted that study. That study actually found an extremely small response. And what you're seeing here is the actual response is this number right here. It's more like not 0.3%, I'm sorry, around 0.005. So 0.5%, that's right. And that's about 1/60th. It essentially said that you could double the profitability of forestry in the US, even in the US where we have a lot of commercial forestry, and have essentially no effect on global land area. The reason that influential study got it wrong is it misinterpreted the calculation here, that the 30% was not actually related to forest profitability. It was more related to, a change in a small background change. It was a misinterpretation. Okay, more broadly, if we want to really understand the effects of forestry, we shouldn't even be using kind of economic models. We just want to know what the effect of forestry is versus no forestry. And here's why. Let me give you an analogy of how we analyze the greenhouse gas emissions of basically any other human activity like driving. So if we want to know the emissions of driving a large car, we basically just estimate how much carbon dioxide comes out the end of the car for every kilometer it drives, and we multiply that by the number of kilometers, and that gives us the estimate. And we'll do the same thing for a small car. Now, we probably find that a large car has around twice the emissions of a small car. So that's what it is. Now, what if we use an economic model to say, well, what happens if we tax large cars? Well, it would probably predict that most people would just switch to small cars. And the result would be you'd only save half of the emissions. And similarly, if someone were kind of stupid enough to just say we're going to tax small cars but not large cars, people would probably switch to large cars. And you could therefore say that actually driving a small car has negative emissions compared to driving a large car. But we wouldn't say, even though that would be the effect, we wouldn't say that driving a small car only has half the emissions, driving a large car has only half the emissions, driving a small car, driving a large, has half the emissions, driving a small car has negative emissions. And then if you drive half of each, you have no emissions. So that's basically a different question. Economic models are designed to say how human activity changes with one policy or another, not what are the emissions of an actual human activity. And the reason this matters is for forestry, what we want to know is what happens with forestry versus just leaving the trees alone. And that tells us how much carbon we could gain if we reduced our forestry, reduced our wood demand. And similarly, how much carbon we lose if we increase that wood demand. Now, what about wood from tropical plantations? So today you cannot make CLT from eucalyptus, but you might be able to in the future. And there are some other types of tropical plantations. And we found, yes, that if you were able to use a large percentage of the wood from a tropical plantation for CLT, you could actually gain a carbon benefit. And that assumes, again, that we have a pretty substantial savings in from production emissions, kind of fossil emissions, in using CLT instead of concrete and steel in buildings. And that adds up over time. And we estimated in Brazil, for example, that a plantation could deliver a 75% reduction compared to this estimate of the emissions from concrete and steel. But the problem is that existing plantations are already fully used. And we're going to need even more of them just to meet rising wood demand without mass timber. So the only way to do this and support mass timber would be to convert a lot of natural forests in the tropics into plantations. And the problem is that is terrible for biodiversity. I mean, this is even a secondary forest. here's a eucalyptus plantation in Brazil, and there is very little living in that eucalyptus plantation. And it also has other huge water demands and other kinds of pollution challenges. It might be part of the way of meeting demand for existing wood, but we don't want to have even more demand for wood and yet even more eucalyptus plantations. And in fact, there was a paper in 2022 by researchers at the Potsdam Institute, and it basically said, yeah, if we use tropical plantations to provide wood for mass timber, we can get a greenhouse gas benefit by 2100. But even though they seem to be in favor of this, it came with huge costs. So even without mass timber, basically what the model was predicting is that we'd gain about 150 million hectares of tropical plantations, mostly tropical plantations, but we'd lose that from natural forest, the pink and the dark green. And if you went to 90% construction with mass timber, you would end up having to raise that from 150 million to 300 million. And we'd lose more than 300 million hectares of natural forest. And then we'd also lose even additional valuable woody savannas and things in the tropical area. So that would have enormous ecological cost. So one question is whether there is an alternative. And one thing I've learned from colleagues sponsoring this talk is that there is, that instead of having conventional cement, concrete, we have limestone, calcined clay cement. And because it cooks less limestone, it produces around 40% fewer emissions. And if you use that as well to make cement blocks instead of bricks, you can save 50% of emissions, at least on a kind of a apartment building of a certain size. And this is something that is available apparently right now. It's approved and doesn't actually involve massive loss of the world's tropical forests. So I'll leave you with the following thought. Here's a map of all the world's land, and we have a fixed amount of land and increasing demand for it. But it's not just we have a fixed amount of land, we really have a fixed amount of capacity to produce plants. And that's basically shown in the green with the darker colors being more plants. It's called net primary productivity of native vegetation. And basically, human activity has not increased that, it's decreased that overall. And that's basically what we have to play with. And somehow within that constraint, we need to produce more food, more wood, more livestock products, somehow accommodate urban expansion, and yet we want to sequester and store more carbon. And the only way to do that is to try to use it less. Thank you very much.